The vote passed at 6:14 in the morning, station time. I watched every single marker go up. 217 species, and not one of them hesitated. My name is Colin Ward, and I had been Earth's senior diplomatic attaché aboard the Galactic Conclave Station for 11 years. I had sat in that chamber during drought negotiations, border disputes, trade collapses, and species extinctions. I had seen things that would take a person's breath away, but nothing, in 11 years, had ever made my hands go cold the way they did that morning. Resolution 7 Omega had been on the table for 3 years. On its surface, it was a labor classification bill. Buried inside, it was something else entirely. It reclassified Earth as a managed labor world, which in galactic legal terms meant one thing. The people of Earth had no sovereign rights, no right to refuse contracts, no right to set wages, no right to withdraw their labor. Every human being who worked off-world, and there were more than 12 million of us, would become a contracted resource. Not a person, a resource. I had spent 2 years fighting it in committee. I had submitted 231 formal objections. I had called in every diplomatic favor Earth had ever earned, and we had earned quite a few, because humans are good workers and everyone in the galaxy knew it. I thought that meant something. I thought leverage meant something. The chamber was quiet as the vote was tallied. The conclave speaker, a Vreth elder named Osovian, read the result with the kind of flat tone that people use when they have already decided the outcome does not require any emotion. 217 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstentions. I sat very still. The species around me began to settle back into their seats. The Vreth delegation, who had pushed the hardest for 7 Omega, were already exchanging what I could only describe as satisfied glances. The Solani ambassador, a creature whose people had 3 times asked Earth for emergency medical support when a plague swept their colonies, did not look at me once. The Calder Dominion's representative, whose government had 17 active contracts with human engineering firms, tapped his datapad and moved on to the next item on the agenda. I stood up. Osovian looked at me with his wide amber eyes. Attaché Ward, the vote is concluded. You may register a formal objection through the standard. I am not here to object, I said. The chamber went quiet in a different way, not the polished quiet of procedure, but the uncertain quiet of something unexpected. I am here to inform the conclave that I am closing the Earth diplomatic office on this station, effective immediately, I said. All Earth diplomatic personnel will be departing within the next 6 hours. I will be transmitting the result of this vote to Earth Command before I leave. Osovian blinked slowly. Attaché Ward, I would caution against a reaction that. I am not reacting, I said. I am reporting. There is a difference. I picked up my datapad, walked out of the chamber, and did not look back. The corridor outside was long and bright, the walls lined with the flags and seals of every member species. I walked past all of them without slowing down. My junior attaché, a young woman named Laura Finch, fell into step beside me without a word. She had been watching the vote from the gallery. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. How long have we known this was coming? She asked quietly. Since the second committee review, I said. 14 months ago. She was quiet for a moment. And Earth Command? Has known for 14 months, I said. She did not say anything else. She was smart enough to understand what that meant. You do not spend 14 months knowing something is coming, without spending 14 months preparing for it. Back at the diplomatic office, I sent a single message to Earth Command. It contained the full text of Resolution 7 Omega, the final vote tally, the timestamp, and one additional line. Vote confirmed. All diplomatic personnel departing, awaiting your signal. The response came back in 40 seconds. 40 seconds, which told me that someone on the other end had been sitting at a console, waiting. It said, Signal received. Initiate protocol. Welcome home, Colin. I looked at those words for a long time. Then I began packing. Around me, the rest of the Earth diplomatic team was already moving. 8 people, all calm, all efficient. No one was panicking. No one was crying. Laura was already pulling the encryption cores from the communication systems. Our communications officer, A man named Paul Crane was quietly copying the last 6 months of diplomatic traffic onto a secure drive. Nobody spoke above a murmur. We had drilled this. Not officially, not on any schedule that went into the conclave's records, but we had drilled it. I walked to the window that overlooked the station's central hub. Far below, I could see the vast trading floors, the docking arms, the transit rings. 12 species worth of commerce flowing in every direction. Hundreds of human workers down there, moving cargo, running diagnostics, managing life support systems that half the station depended on. They did not know yet. They would be told in the right order, at the right time. The Vreth station manager came to our office door 40 minutes after I left the chamber. He was a large species, the Vreth, built low and wide, with a voice that always sounded slightly irritated. His name was Thuvrak, and I had worked alongside him for 6 years. "Attaché Ward," he said, looking at the half-empty office around me. "I must ask you to reconsider this course of action. The resolution is now galactic law. Your withdrawal from diplomatic channels will only—" "Thuvrak," I said, "how many human technicians are currently running the atmospheric processors on this station's lower ring?" He paused. "That is not relevant to—" "41, I said. "How many human crew are aboard the 17 cargo freighters currently docked at this station?" "I do not see what." "About 300, I said. "How many human medical staff are working in the station infirmary right now?" He stopped talking. "I am not threatening anything," I said. "I am simply observing that Earth contributes a great deal to the operation of this station, and to the operations of a very large number of facilities, colonies, and vessels throughout this galaxy. I think it would be useful for you to sit with that observation for a while. Have a good day, Thuvrak." I closed the office door. Laura was looking at me from across the room. "You just told him," she said. "No," I said. "I gave him information and let him draw his own conclusions. That is not the same thing." We were on a transport ship and moving away from the station by midday. 14 of us in total, including staff from the trade office and the cultural exchange program. The station grew smaller behind us through the viewport. Nobody celebrated, nobody complained. We just watched it shrink. Paul Crane came to sit beside me 2 hours into the journey. He had the kind of face that looked permanently tired, but his eyes were always moving, always sharp. "The Vreth frequency spiked 3 times in the last hour," he said quietly. "They are transmitting to 6 other conclave members. The Solani and the Calder are both listed as recipients." "Of course they are," I said. "They are worried," he said. "Good," I said. "They should be." He nodded slowly. "How long do you think it takes before they realize?" I thought about the network of human workers spread across 400 stations. The engineers, the medics, the pilots, the technicians who kept alien life support systems running, because their own species could not quite manage the calibration. The dock workers who loaded cargo on a schedule so tight that a single missed shift caused delays across 3 systems. The quiet, competent, indispensable presence of human hands in every corner of the galaxy. "They already know something is wrong," I said. "They just do not know how wrong yet." I leaned back and closed my eyes. Behind us, the station was already a point of light among thousands. Earth was 6 days away. I spent the journey sleeping and reading, and saying very little. There was nothing more to do, not yet. The work had already been set in motion long before I walked out of that chamber. All I had done this morning was make it official. When we entered Earth's orbital space and the planet came into view, green and blue and impossibly familiar after years among the cold geometry of alien stations, I felt something loosen in my chest, something I had been holding tight for a very long time. We landed, and I stepped out into air that smelled like rain and grass and something so ordinary it almost hurt. There was a woman waiting at the edge of the landing pad. Her name was General Diana Oakes, and she was the head of Earth Command's Strategic Affairs Division. She was a short woman with silver hair and the kind of stillness that people develop when they have spent decades making decisions that other people will have to live with. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "How did they look when you walked out?" I thought about Asovian's amber eyes. About Thuvrak in the doorway. About the Solani ambassador who had never looked at me once. Surprised, I said. She nodded slowly. Good. Let them be surprised for a while. That is exactly what we need. She turned and walked toward the operations building, and I followed her into whatever came next. Behind me, a soft wind moved across the landing pad, and the door closed, and Earth was very, very quiet. 3 months passed. Not slowly, quietly. There is a difference between those two things that people do not always understand. Slow is when time drags and you feel every minute. Quiet is when things move without noise, without announcement, without anyone watching closely enough to notice. Earth went quiet. No trade ships departed carrying human crews. No labor contracts were renewed. No new workers signed deployment papers. The communication channels that Earth had maintained with the Galactic Conclave and its member species went to a standard holding message. Earth's diplomatic offices are currently in a period of internal review. All inquiries will be addressed in due course. In due course. That phrase alone must have been maddening to the species who had voted for Resolution 7 Omega, because it was polite. It was procedurally correct. It gave them absolutely nothing to push back against. You cannot sanction a species for being in a period of internal review. You cannot file a formal complaint against a holding message. I was stationed at a small facility called Relay Post 7, which sat in a quiet corner of the outer edge of human-controlled space. It was not glamorous. 36 people, a communications array, and a lot of empty space. But it had something that mattered more than glamour. It was outside the Conclave's monitoring range, and it had a direct line to Earth Command. My job, for those 3 months, was to listen. The Vreth sent their first formal inquiry to Earth's diplomatic holding channel 9 days after we left the station. It was phrased carefully, in the diplomatic language that the Conclave used for sensitive matters. It asked whether Earth intended to honor its current labor deployment agreements, and it noted that several Vreth-operated facilities were experiencing staffing concerns. Staffing concerns. I read that and almost laughed. 9 days. That was how long it took before the cracks started showing. The Vreth were the first because they had pushed hardest for 7 Omega, which meant they had the most to lose. Their manufacturing rings were enormous, spread across 4 systems, and they ran on human efficiency. The Vreth themselves were brilliant engineers in terms of design, but their manual dexterity was limited, and their tolerance for repetitive precision work was low. They had solved that problem, like most galactic species had solved similar problems, by hiring humans. 12 days after the first inquiry, they sent a second. The language was less careful this time. It asked for confirmation that Earth would be resuming normal operations within the next standard month. By day 30, the Vreth were no longer filing inquiries. They were filing complaints. The complaints went to the Conclave's Trade Regulation Committee, which was the correct bureaucratic route, and which would also take approximately 4 months to process. The Conclave had excellent procedures. It also had the processing speed of a very large, very old institution that had never needed to move quickly, because nothing had ever surprised it badly enough to require urgency. I received transcripts of those complaints through a contact I will not name, who worked in the Conclave's administrative division, and who had always believed that what happened to Earth was wrong. I read the Vreth complaint carefully. 3 of their manufacturing rings had dropped to 40% capacity. The automated systems were running, but the calibration tasks that kept the automated systems running were human tasks, and those humans had not shown up. The Vreth technicians who tried to cover the work were making errors, not out of laziness, but because the human teams had spent years developing specific knowledge of those systems that could not simply be transferred in a month. That specific knowledge, that was the thing no one had ever thought about when they looked at human workers and saw a resource. A resource does not carry irreplaceable knowledge in its hands and in its memory. A person does. The Solani were next. Their situation was more serious, because what the Solani had used human workers for was not manufacturing. It was water processing. The Solani home system had 3 habitable moons. All of them orbited a gas giant with powerful radiation belts. Managing the water filtration systems on those moons required constant recalibration against radiation interference. And that recalibration was a job that human workers had taken on because humans were, biologically, far more radiation resistant than Solani. The Solani engineers could do the work in theory. In practice, they could not sustain the exposure hours that the job required. 17 water processing facilities had human teams. When those teams did not return from their last scheduled leave, the Solani began running the facilities with their own people on rotation, limiting exposure hours, covering shifts across a smaller workforce. By the end of the second month, 6 facilities were running at half capacity. 2 had been taken offline entirely because the calibration error rates were too high to risk. I received a detailed report on this from Paul Crane, who had stayed in contact with sources across the galactic network. He sent the information in compressed packets through channels that were legal, unremarkable, and completely unmonitored. When I read it, I thought about the 3 times Solani ambassadors had requested Earth's emergency medical support during the plague outbreaks in their system. I thought about the human doctors and nurses who had gone. I thought about the Solani ambassador in the chamber, who had never looked at me once. I did not feel anything sharp when I thought about it. Just a slow, settled awareness of how things were. The Calder Dominion situation was perhaps the most serious of all, because the Calder had used human workers in a place no one should ever allow a dependency to develop: medical infrastructure. The Calder had a sophisticated medical system, genuinely advanced in most respects, but they had a species-specific limitation. Their fine motor control in surgical procedures was excellent for their own anatomy, but their biology made them deeply sensitive to the electromagnetic frequencies used in the diagnostic equipment that had become standard across the galactic medical network. That equipment had originally been designed by a collaborative team that included human engineers, and it had been calibrated, without any deliberate intent, around human tolerance ranges. Human medical technicians could operate that equipment without issue. They had been doing so in Calder hospitals and clinics for 20 years. When those technicians did not return, the Calder faced a choice between using equipment that made their own people ill and not using it at all. They chose not to use it, and their diagnostic capacity dropped significantly. I read these reports at a small desk in Relay Post 7, in a room that smelled faintly of recycled air and old coffee, and I thought about a woman named Sandra Voss. Sandra was a human medical technician who had worked in a Calder hospital for 8 years. She was from a small city in the north of England, and she had gone off-world at 22, because the pay was good and the work was interesting. I had met her once, during a diplomatic tour of the Calder's medical facilities. She had shown me around the diagnostic wing with quiet pride. She knew every machine, every setting, every quirk. The Calder doctors she worked with trusted her completely. Sandra was now home. Earth had quietly recalled every human worker on a new contract arrangement, one that redirected their skills to domestic and allied projects. She was working at a hospital in Edinburgh, and by all accounts doing excellent work. The people who had voted to make her a managed resource had lost her completely, and they had not even seen it coming. By the end of month 2, I had received initial contact signals from 4 different conclave member species, all of whom had somehow obtained the relay post's frequency. None of them were official contacts. All of them were diplomatic staff reaching out privately, in that careful way that people reach out when they want to communicate something without creating a record. The messages were all variations of the same theme. There was concern. There was hope for dialogue. There was an openness to discussion. I did not respond to any of them. Not because I was being cruel, but because it was not yet time, and because any response I sent would have told them something about our position and our patience, and I was not authorized to give them that information. Not yet. Laura Finch was at the relay post with me. She was handling the incoming data streams and building the kind of detailed picture of galactic economic stress that would eventually become very important evidence. One evening, she put a summary on my desk. It was a single page, which was a choice in itself, because the full data ran to hundreds of pages. The summary said, in plain language, that the galactic economy had contracted by approximately 3% in 2 months. That number sounds small. In a galactic economy, It is not small. It represents thousands of disrupted supply chains, delayed construction projects, unprocessed raw materials, cargo sitting in the wrong place, medical supplies that were not delivered, food shipments that were late. It represents, in short, what happens when you remove a working part from a machine and discover the machine cannot compensate. They thought we were replaceable, Laura said, looking out the viewport at the dark. They thought we were a resource, I said. Resources do not have relationships with the machines they operate. Resources do not carry years of specific knowledge. Resources do not have the ability to choose. She was quiet. The mistake they made, I said, was forgetting that we were people. People who had been working inside their most critical systems for decades. People who had been quietly becoming indispensable, while they were busy deciding how to classify us. She turned and looked at me. How much longer? I checked the time against the signal schedule from Earth Command. A few more weeks, I said. They need to be uncomfortable enough to listen, not desperate enough to react instead of think. She nodded slowly and went back to her data streams. I stayed at the viewport for a while longer. Out there, somewhere across the dark, 17 water processing facilities were struggling. Manufacturing rings were running at half speed. Hospitals were managing without the equipment they needed. Species that had voted unanimously to strip humans of their rights were learning, in the most practical possible way, what that decision actually cost. They had called us a managed resource. Out here in the quiet, at a relay post that most of the galaxy did not know existed, I was watching that word become the most expensive mistake they had ever made. 3 weeks, and 4 days after Laura asked how much longer, Earth Command sent the signal. It arrived as a standard encoded packet, the kind that relay posts receive dozens of every day. The decryption key was embedded in a sequence that I had been given before leaving Earth, and had memorized rather than written down. When the message resolved on my screen, it contained a timestamp, a confirmation code, and a single line of instruction, broadcast on all open conclave frequencies at the designated time. Do not modify the content. Attached to the message was a document. I read it 3 times. Then I called Laura and Paul into the relay post small conference room and read it aloud to them. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Paul said slowly, "They actually did it." "Yes," I said. Laura had both hands flat on the table, as if she needed to feel something solid. "This is going to go everywhere," she said. "That is the point," I said. The document Earth Command had prepared was not a declaration of war. It was not a threat. It was not a diplomatic protest. It was something far more precise and far more difficult to argue with. It was an invoice. The document opened with a brief statement of context. It referenced Resolution 7 Omega, its passage date, and the unanimous vote. It noted, without judgment, that the Galactic Conclave had formally classified Earth as a managed labor world, which reclassified human workers as contracted resources rather than sovereign persons. It then said that Earth accepted this classification, retroactively, extending back to the date of first contact between humanity and the galactic community. If human workers were resources, then their labor had a value. If their labor had a value, then every hour of that labor, from the very beginning, should have been compensated at the rate appropriate for a managed labor world under galactic law. Not the rates that had been negotiated by free workers with their own bargaining power, because free workers did not exist under 7 Omega. Managed resources had a standardized rate, set by the Conclave itself, that was higher than what most species had actually been paying for human labor, because the Conclave rate included maintenance overhead, administrative fees, and resource management costs that the species had never been charging themselves. Earth had calculated the difference between what had actually been paid and what should have been paid, under the law that the Conclave had just created, for every human working hour recorded since first contact. Then it had applied the compound interest rate that the Conclave's own trade agreements mandated for unpaid resource contracts. The total figure at the bottom of the document was a number so large that I had to read it twice to be sure I was understanding the units correctly. It was presented in the Conclave's standard currency, and it was roughly equivalent to the combined gross economic output of the 4 largest member species for an entire standard year. Below the total, in plain language, it said, "Payment is due within 90 standard days. In the event of non-payment, Earth reserves the right to pursue remediation through all available means, including the immediate suspension of all human labor deployment to non-paying entities." And then, at the very bottom, one more line. "This invoice has been prepared under the legal framework established by Resolution 7 Omega. Earth thanks the Galactic Conclave for providing the legal clarity necessary to calculate these figures." I looked at Paul across the table. "Ready?" He pulled up the broadcast interface. "Ready." "Send it," I said. The document went out on every open conclave frequency simultaneously, at the timestamp Earth Command had designated. It went to every member species. It went to the conclave's central administrative offices. It went to the trade networks, the news services, the economic reporting channels. It went everywhere that mattered, all at once, with no warning and no prior notice. We did not have to wait long for the response. The first alert came through 11 minutes after broadcast. A Vreth financial exchange had suspended trading pending review of an unexpected external communication affecting projected labor cost structures. That was the polite way of saying that the invoice had hit their financial network, and the people running the exchange did not know how to price anything until they understood what they were looking at. 17 minutes after broadcast, the Calder Dominion's primary commodities index dropped 4% in a single pricing cycle. That had not happened since the Calder border war 14 years ago. 26 minutes after broadcast, 3 Solani trade guilds issued simultaneous statements saying they were requesting emergency guidance from the Conclave's Trade Regulation Committee. The Trade Regulation Committee, which had been slowly processing the Vreth's complaints about human staffing shortages, was suddenly receiving approximately 400 urgent communications at once. Their response time, already measured in months, became entirely theoretical. Paul was watching the financial feeds with an expression that was trying very hard to stay neutral, and not quite succeeding. 3 markets in the first half hour, he said. "Colin, 3 markets. "The invoice itself is not the damage," I said. "The invoice is the question. The damage comes from everyone in those markets trying to answer it at the same time." The question the invoice asked was simple, even if the document was long. It asked, what is a human worker actually worth? And it asked that question at a moment when every species that depended on human labor was already experiencing what life looked like without it. The answer that the galactic financial community was discovering, in real time, was that a human worker was worth considerably more than anyone had been paying. The Conclave's own resource management rates, the rates embedded in the very law they had passed, were higher than market rates. They had written that into the law without thinking about it, because the rate had been designed for theoretical resource management, and no one had actually run the numbers against real human labor volumes. No one, that is, except Earth Command. Laura was monitoring the diplomatic channels. She looked up from her screen. "The Vreth Foreign Minister is requesting a direct communication with Earth Command. Earth Command will not receive that communication for another 72 hours, I said. "Standard processing time." She almost smiled. Of course. The standard processing time was not accidental. It was the same delay the Conclave used when it wanted to let a diplomatic situation breathe before responding. Earth was simply applying the same courtesy. Over the next 4 days, I watched the invoice move through the galactic community like a slow, quiet wave. News services covered it. Economic analysts tried to assess it. Legal scholars spent a great deal of time examining the document's argument and finding, to what I imagined was their considerable discomfort, that it was legally sound. Earth had not invented the framework. Earth had applied the framework that the Conclave had created to the situation the Conclave had created, and arrived at a number using the Conclave's own mathematics. You cannot tell someone their math is wrong when it is your math. The Solani ambassador to the Conclave issued a public statement saying that the invoice was provocative and counterproductive to galactic stability. She did not say it was incorrect. That distinction mattered enormously. The Calder Dominion's Trade Council said that the invoice raises important questions about the implementation of Resolution 7 Omega that require careful consideration. They did not say the invoice was invalid. That mattered too. On the 5th day after broadcast, the first of the galactic financial markets formally suspended trading in any contract that involved human labor, pending legal clarity. That suspension froze approximately 12% of all active contracts in the affected market. On the 6th day, 2 more markets followed. On the 7th day, a conclave administrative official, speaking in a personal capacity, said in an interview that Resolution 7 Omega had perhaps been passed without a full impact assessment. I read that quote 3 times. Then I sent a brief update to Earth Command. It said, "The invoice is doing exactly what it was supposed to do. They are beginning to argue with each other. Recommend proceeding to the next phase on schedule." The response came back in an hour. Confirmed. Proceed. I looked out at the dark beyond the relay post's viewport for a moment. The 90-day payment deadline was running. No one was going to pay. Everyone in the galaxy understood that the invoice was not truly a request for payment. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that Earth had done the math. A demonstration that Earth understood the law better than the people who wrote it. A demonstration that Earth had not left the table in anger, but in preparation. The next phase was something else entirely. Something that had been building in silence for 14 months. Inside the critical systems of 400 stations and 9 colony zones, one quiet human hand at a time. Nobody paid the invoice. Not within 90 days, and not after. The conclave's response, when it finally came through official channels 63 days after the broadcast, was a formal request to suspend the payment deadline, pending a multilateral review of Resolution 7 Omega's implementation framework. It was written in the careful, padded language of institutions that know they have made an error, but are not ready to say so out loud. I sent back an equally careful acknowledgement. I said that Earth was committed to respectful dialogue and would take the request under advisement. Earth did not, in fact, take it under advisement. What Earth did, on the 91st day, was act. Not with ships. Not with any announcement. Not with any move that could be classified, under galactic law, as hostile action. The first thing that happened was so quiet that it took the Vreth 2 days to understand what they were looking at. A Vreth manufacturing ring in the Keth system, the one that processed approximately 40% of their civilian export goods, stopped. Not an explosion, not a systems failure, not a technical error that could be diagnosed and corrected. The automated systems were still running. The power was on. Every machine was operational. The ring simply stopped producing output because the human teams who had been managing the calibration sequences that kept the automated systems working correctly had been given new instructions, and those instructions did not include calibration. The Vreth maintenance crews went in and looked at everything. All the machines were fine. All the power systems were fine. All the automation was fine. There was simply no one who knew how to tell the automation what to do next, because the people who carried that knowledge had gone home, and the documentation they had left behind did not fully capture what they knew, because years of refined understanding never fully fits into a document. The ring sat idle. On the same day, a water processing facility on the second Solani moon produced a calibration error that triggered its automatic safety shutdown. The shutdown was correct. The system had detected a miscalculation in the radiation interference compensation matrix and had done exactly what it was designed to do, which was stop operating rather than produce contaminated water. The human technician who would normally have corrected that calibration in about 40 minutes was in Manchester, working for a domestic water authority. The facility stayed shut down. 2 days after that, the primary fuel depot serving the Calder Dominion's Third Fleet went on lockdown. This one required a little more explanation, because the depot was not an automated facility. It was staffed. The staff was a human crew of 68 people who had been working the depot for an average of 4 years each. They knew the depot the way people know a place they have lived in for a long time. Every system, every quirk, every workaround that the original designers had never documented. On the 93rd day after the invoice, those 68 people received an updated deployment order from Earth Command, reassigning them to a domestic infrastructure project. The order was legitimate. It was processed through proper channels. It gave the crew 2 weeks to complete an orderly handover. The handover, to the small team of Calder operators who came to take over the depot, was scrupulously professional. The human crew documented everything they could. They answered every question they were asked. They did not sabotage anything, did not damage anything, did not take anything that was not theirs. They simply left, and took with them everything that no document could hold. The Calder team took 3 days to lock the depot down themselves, because they could not get the security systems to accept their credentials in the right sequence. And the sequence mattered, because the system had been customized over 4 years by a human administrator named Greg Walton, who had found the original configuration unnecessarily complicated, and improved it. And the improvement worked beautifully, as long as you knew what Greg had done, and the Calder team did not know what Greg had done. The fuel depot was not destroyed. It was not seized. It was simply inaccessible to the people who needed it most, through no malicious action whatsoever, simply as a natural consequence of Greg Walton going home. I was coordinating all of this from Relay Post 7, but coordinating is perhaps too active a word for what I was doing. The actions had been planned long before I sat down at this relay post. Human workers in critical positions across the galaxy had been quietly given new orders, new contracts, new deployment papers, over the preceding 14 months, all timed to activate in sequence. I was not directing anything. I was watching a plan unfold, and occasionally sending status updates to Earth Command. Laura was tracking the cascade of effects with the focused attention of someone watching a very complicated equation resolve itself. The Vreth manufacturing ring has been down for 6 days, she said, reading from her data screen. They have filed for emergency arbitration with the Conclave's Trade Committee to compel Earth to provide replacement workers. How long will arbitration take? I asked. Under the Conclave's standard timeline, a minimum of 8 months. And their reserve stock of processed goods? She checked. At current consumption rates, they run out in about 3 months. I nodded. The Solani facility is still shut down, she continued. They have brought in a team from the Galactic Engineering Collective to attempt a manual restart, but the team is not familiar with the specific radiation parameters of that moon's environment, and they are being cautious. Estimated restart timeline, if everything goes correctly, is 6 weeks. And they have enough water from their other facilities to cover the gap? Barely. They are rationing on the second moon. Paul came in from the communications room. He had the slightly disbelieving expression that had become his default over the past weeks. The Calder Fleet Command has formally grounded their 3rd fleet, pending fuel depot access. A fleet, I said. 300 ships, he said. Ground. I let that sit for a moment. Not to enjoy it, but to understand it fully. A fleet of 300 ships, grounded, because Greg Walton had gone home. This was not warfare. No weapon had been fired. No ship had moved aggressively. No system had been damaged or destroyed. Everything the humans had done was legal. Everything the humans had done was simply the natural result of a workforce choosing, as sovereign people, to work elsewhere. The Conclave had tried to classify those people as resources. Resources do not choose. They had found out, in the most concrete possible terms, that the classification was wrong. By the 40th day after the actions began, the effects had spread beyond the initial targets. The Vreth manufacturing ring's shutdown had rippled into the supply chains of 6 other species that sourced components from that ring. The Solani water rationing had triggered concerns about whether 2 planned colony expansions could proceed. The grounded Calder fleet had created a security gap in a border region that 3 other species depended on for their own safety. The Conclave was no longer quietly requesting dialogue. It was requesting dialogue with a degree of urgency that its formal language could barely contain. A Vreth official, speaking publicly for the first time with real directness, said that the situation was a manufactured crisis designed to coerce the conclave. He was right. But he was also describing exactly what Resolution 7 Omega had been, and he could not see that, or perhaps he simply could not say it. On the 45th day, the conclave speaker, Osovian himself, issued a formal request for a face-to-face dialogue session with an authorized Earth representative, at a neutral location, at Earth's convenience. At Earth's convenience. I read those words and thought about the morning of the vote, about Osovian, reading the result in his flat, procedural tone. 217 in favor, 0 opposed. I forwarded the request to Earth Command and waited. The response came in 4 hours. It said, confirmed. You are authorized to represent Earth in the dialogue session. Location, Neutral Station 11. Timing, 14 days from today. Bring the document. I knew which document they meant. I had been given a copy of it the same day I was given the invoice. I had read it only once, and then locked it in the most secure storage the relay post had. It was time to read it again. I was the only human on Neutral Station 11 when the conclave delegation arrived. That was a deliberate choice, and when Osovian walked into the dialogue chamber with 11 senior representatives behind him, all of them looking at my single chair across the table from their 12, I could see that the disparity registered. They had come with numbers, with presence, with the weight of institutional authority. I had come alone. Sometimes alone is the stronger position. The chamber was a standard conclave neutral space. Plain walls, a long table, chairs calibrated to multiple species. Osovian took the central seat. The Vreth foreign minister sat to his left. The Solani representative, a different one from the woman who had refused to look at me during the vote, sat 3 seats down. The Calder Trade Council's lead delegate was at the far end. All 12 of them had data pads. All 12 of them looked, in various species-specific ways, like people who had not been sleeping well. I had a single document on the table in front of me, face down. Attaché Ward, Osovian said, on behalf of the Galactic Conclave, I thank you for agreeing to this dialogue. I appreciate the opportunity, I said. He settled into the careful posture of a senior diplomat beginning a difficult conversation. The conclave wishes to acknowledge that the period since the passage of Resolution 7 Omega has been one of considerable disruption, and that a productive dialogue on implementation concerns would benefit all parties. Implementation concerns. That was the phrase they were using for the manufacturing ring that had been dark for 45 days, for the rationed water on the Solani moon, for 300 Calder warships sitting on the ground because Greg Walton went home. I appreciate the conclave's openness to dialogue, I said. I also have a document I have been asked to present on Earth's behalf. I turned the document over and placed it, face up, in the center of the table. Osovian leaned forward. The representatives on either side of him followed. For a moment, all 12 of them were reading. The document was not long. It was precise. It was titled, The Treaty of Reclassification. It opened with a formal rescission clause. Every signatory species would formally rescind their vote in favor of Resolution 7 Omega, creating an official record in the conclave's legal archives that the resolution was a mistake and had been corrected. Not suspended, not amended, not deferred. Corrected, rescinded. The second clause covered reparations. Each signatory species would pay, on a schedule determined by Earth Command, a sum representing the economic and social harm caused by the resolution's passage and the period of disruption that followed. The sums were detailed in an attached schedule, calculated differently for each species, based on their level of dependency on human labor and the specific harms their actions had contributed to. The third clause addressed the colonial zones. Every human-administered colonial zone that had been classified as a labor resource territory under 7 Omega would be formally transferred to Earth Command's governance authority, permanently and without condition. The fourth clause was what made the room go very still. It said that any species that did not sign the treaty would be placed on an indefinite labor exclusion list, meaning no human worker would take any contract with that species or any entity operating in their jurisdiction, and a second invoice would be prepared, covering the ongoing period of non-payment, compounded monthly under the same legal framework as the first. The fifth clause said that all existing human workers who had chosen to remain in non-exclusion species employment would do so as fully sovereign persons under Earth's legal protection, with wages, protections, and conditions determined by Earth's employment standards, not by the Conclave's resource management framework. I watched them read it. The Vreth foreign minister's skin, which was typically a warm amber, had gone several shades lighter. He was reading the reparations schedule in the attached document, which I could tell because his eyes had stopped moving and were fixed on a single point on the page. The Solani representative was very still. Osovian looked up at me when he finished. "This document," he said slowly, "leaves very little room for negotiation." "It was not designed to leave room for negotiation," I said. "It was designed to be clear." He was quiet for a moment. "Attaché Ward, you must understand that the passage of Resolution 7 Omega was not a decision made with any intent to cause harm to humanity." "I understand that," I said. "It was made with indifference to humanity. The intent was your own convenience. The harm was a side effect you did not calculate in advance, because you did not consider us carefully enough to calculate it. I understand that distinction. The treaty does not ask you to have intended harm. It asks you to correct it." Silence. "The timelines in the reparations schedule," the Calder delegate said carefully, "are shorter than what our Treasury cycles can comfortably. Earth's economists reviewed the Treasury cycle data for all 12 species represented here before the schedule was written." I said, "The timelines are tight, but they are within capacity. Uncomfortable, but possible." The Calder delegate looked at his datapad and said nothing more. The Vreth foreign minister said, "The rescission clause, requiring a formal record that the resolution was a mistake. Our government would face significant internal difficulty." "The resolution was a mistake," I said. "The record should reflect that. I understand that formal acknowledgement is uncomfortable. I would ask the minister to consider what 45 more days of a dark manufacturing ring does to your government's position, before weighing the discomfort of acknowledgement against the discomfort of continuation." He stopped talking. Osovian had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who is understanding, in real time, that the conversation is not going the way they expected. He had come to negotiate. He had expected positions, concessions, a back and forth. He had expected Earth to want something it was willing to accept less than the full measure of. "You are not here to bargain," he said, finally. "No," I said. "Earth bargained for 11 years. 41 rejected petitions. I was there for most of them. I filed 231 formal objections to 7 Omega alone. Earth used every diplomatic process available to it before that vote happened. After the vote, Earth chose a different approach." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, if we do not sign, then the people working in your systems now do not come back when their current contracts end," I said. "The workers who have already come home do not return. The invoice compounds. And Earth prepares a full accounting of every system, every facility, every operation in conclave space that has a human dependency, so that you know precisely what you are choosing to manage without us, and for how long." The Solani representative spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and even. "You have been planning this for a long time. Resolution 7 Omega took 3 years to move through committee," I said. "We did not learn about it 3 years ago. We learned about it much earlier than that. We had time to prepare." She nodded, slowly, as if something had just become clear that had been puzzling her for months. Osovian looked at the treaty for a long time without speaking. The chamber was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system running, a soft, constant sound like faraway wind. Then he picked up his signature instrument. "I need 1 hour," he said, "to consult privately with the delegation." "Of course," I said. "I will be outside." I stood, picked up nothing, because the treaty stayed on the table, and walked out of the chamber. In the corridor outside, I sat down on a low bench and looked at the opposite wall. It was plain and white, and gave me nothing in particular to look at, which was exactly what I needed. I had been carrying the weight of very precise, very measured calm for so many months that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. I thought about Laura at the relay post, watching her data screens. I thought about Paul, monitoring the financial feeds with his quietly disbelieving expression. I thought about Sandra Voss in Edinburgh, working in a hospital that was glad to have her. I thought about Greg Walton, who had improved a security system because the original design was unnecessarily complicated, and had never known that his sensible improvement would one day ground a fleet of 300 ships. I thought about 12 million human beings scattered across the galaxy, carrying their knowledge and their care and their indispensable hands into every critical system that needed them, because they were people who wanted to do good work and build good lives. Not resources, people. 54 minutes after I sat down, the chamber door opened, and one of the conclave's administrative staff came into the corridor. She was a young Vreth, and she looked at me with wide amber eyes that were trying very hard to be neutral. "Attaché Ward," she said. "The delegation is ready." I stood up and went back inside. All 12 of them were seated exactly as I had left them. The treaty was still in the center of the table. A Sovian looked at me as I sat down. He had the expression of someone who has made a decision that he will have to live with for a long time, and has made his peace with it. "We have discussed the document," he said. "I appreciate that," I said. "There are species on this delegation that will require additional time to ratify through their domestic governance processes. The Calder, in particular, have a legislative review requirement that cannot be bypassed." "Earth is aware of those requirements," I said. "The treaty includes a provisional signing clause. An authorized delegate may sign provisionally today, with full ratification to follow within the domestic timeline. That timeline is specified in Clause 6. He looked at Clause 6. It was already in the document. He had not noticed it the first time, or perhaps he had not reached it before the hour was up. 60 standard days for full ratification, he said. Yes. He looked at the document for one more moment. Then he signed it. The Vreth foreign minister signed next, with deliberate slowness, as if he was making himself do it rather than delaying. One by one, all 12 of them signed. The last signature was the Solani representative. She put her mark at the bottom of the treaty, and then looked up at me. "I want you to know," she said, quietly, "that I voted for 7 Omega because my government instructed me to, not because I believed it was just." I looked at her for a moment. "I know," I said. "I knew that morning. I saw your face." She did not say anything more. I gathered the treaty carefully, both the physical copy and the digital record that the chamber system had been creating throughout the session. "I will transmit the signed document to Earth Command today," I said. "Earth Command will issue a resumption schedule for human labor deployment within 30 days of receiving ratification from all signatory species. All provisions of the treaty apply from the moment of full ratification." I stood, and 12 representatives of the galactic community stood with me. "Thank you for your time today," I said. A Sovian looked at me with his wide amber eyes. "Attaché Ward, what would you have done if we had refused to sign?" I paused. It was a genuine question, asked with genuine curiosity, without any remaining pretense. "Then we would have done what we have always done," I said. "Waited, adapted, found a way forward. Earth is very good at waiting, and very good at adapting. That is one of the things you should perhaps have considered more carefully, before the vote." He nodded once, slowly. I walked out. The corridor was the same plain white it had been when I sat on that bench. The ventilation system was still running. The station around me hummed with the ordinary business of 100 species going about their lives. I found a quiet corner near the communications alcove and transmitted the signed treaty to Earth Command. Then I sent a message to Laura at the relay post. It was 6 words. They signed. Every last one of them. Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. It said, "Coming home." I stood in the quiet of the station corridor, and let myself breathe for a moment. Not a long moment, just enough. There were 30 days of resumption scheduling ahead, hundreds of return contracts to be processed, a reparations timeline to be monitored, 41 rejected petitions worth of history to be formally replaced with something better in the conclave's records. There was a great deal of work left. But outside the station's viewports, across the dark and the distance, 12 million human beings were waiting for the word, not because they had been told to wait, because they had chosen to. That was the difference. That had always